We are here today to attend the talk by Renato Hentchke. So Renato is currently a senior architect at Synopsys. He holds a bachelor, master, and PhD degree in computer science from Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul, Brazil. Through his entire career, Renato specialized in VLSI physical design algorithms for problems such as placement, routing, and related layout challenges. In 2024, Renato joined IBM Research in Thomas Watson Research Center near New York, as an intern for 10 months, working on time-driven routing and placement-driven synthesis. In 2007, Renato joined Intel Corporation, where he stayed for 13 years working in design rule, modeling design, rule abstraction, routing, and the standard cell synthesis. Among other honors, Renato received an Intel Achievement Award in recognition for his contributions to routing automation of the Broadwell project, 14 nanometer processor. In 2020, Renato joined Synopsys, working with layout automation and the DTCO. Renato currently has 45 publication papers with more than 600 citations. So thank you very much, Renato, to accept our invitation. And the floor is with you to start your talk in a very interesting subject now.
Oh, thank you, Hayes. As always, I feel like you guys do a great job choosing conference locations. Honestly, I felt compelled to participate in all of those conferences you was showing before. And thank you for the nice introduction, reading everything about my short bio. This talk, like Hayes said, is about transistor level design beyond standard cell methodology. It is basically a re-edition of I already gave a smaller version of this talk in ISPD 2022. It was like a recognition to Hayes and his research. And today I kind of made the talk a little longer, added a couple more, a little more content. The idea here is to talk about, is there anything we can do to modify the standard cell methodology? As today is basically the way it works, right? You have this cell library that is frozen to you, and you kind of stuck with that, and that gives you some limitations. And what the idea today is that I'm going to talk about those limitations, problems it has, and possible solutions. I'll describe some algorithms that can be used, and it's more like a provocative talk. I want to just, besides the usual Synopsys disclaimers, I just want to say this presentation is entirely my personal vision of the topic. And I have one slide about me. I mean, it's basically a repetition of what Hayes already said. I just wanted to say that I've been doing physical design for a long time, all my career. And so like placement, routing, and cell synthesis, we did this cell synthesis project back in the university like many years ago. And more like recently, as I was kind of the second half of my stay at Intel and a little bit here as well, I've been dealing with SAT algorithms a lot, and I kind of really like them. Like I feel like SAT-based routing and placement is like a really good way to go, and this talk is a lot about that. So here, this slide really summarizes the whole thing that I want to talk today, right? And it is the fact that the standard cells, the way that they are built, the library, the standard cell library, the way that it's built today, it is very, very optimized. Okay, so it's always like a lot of work, mostly done manually. Obviously, there are lots of automation tools out there, many academic and some non-academic, but they're very everything is always needs to be very perfect, and each cell needs to be very well crafted and perfect. And the reason is very simple, actually. right? So if you think about this yellow cell here as maybe a latch, right, and a smaller cell as an inverter or an AND, it is replicated all over the place. The same cell is instantiated thousands of times in the same block, or even millions of times in the chip, right? So you cannot afford to have any inefficiency in principle, right? So so they're really well done. But then all of the care that we have for the cell perfection at its level, then when you go up in the next level, in the block level, they really don't fit together, okay? And this is basically what I'm going to talk about this in this talk. There is a lot of problems associated. They might fit. So look, this one, okay, they happen to fit, but these yellow and this green really they don't fit. And I'm going to explain a little more what I mean by don't fit, right? And you know, I'm just here to challenge this status quo and like maybe give some ideas of how we can make them fit a little better, right? So I think this slide summarizes the idea, right? So given a small region like that, like we look closer, right? Can we actually blend these two cells a little bit so that they actually have a better layout, okay? And you might think, okay, is it even legal to do something like that, right? It definitely goes against the methodology that we all have today, right? A standard cell methodology is there for a long time, right? And it's working great. But yeah, so you know, this definitely goes against that methodology. But I hope I can convince you that doing this can bring some benefits actually that we are leaving behind. Right. So, I mean, there are many ways that we can go beyond the standard cell methodology, and most of them already happen actually. So one of them is that you can say, can we do the layouts by hand, well, like in a custom design fashion, right? It is a lot of work, but you know, it turns out that people do that actually. I mean, we have this RLS blocks where we basically don't do that, but there are custom design blocks where we actually want to do the layout in a custom way. Why is that? Well, because potentially because of the reasons we're going to describe today. When you really want to have the layout really neat and perfect, then you have to do it by hand. Okay, so another idea that I think, especially Hayes always flashed this idea, is that why don't we automatically generate the entire block like a very large standard cell, right? So I mean, obviously it can be done, but you kind of you might lose the abstraction of the cell library. And it turns out that the abstraction of the cell library is actually quite important, especially for timing tools. Like how could we survive not having static timing tools, for example? That's not an option. So we have to keep that abstraction. And I mean, it's possible to do an automatic generation of the block with cell abstraction, but then also we have low layout predictability. So anyway, it's an idea that's out there. It's not the idea that I'm kind of trying to sell today. I'm selling the last one. This is an idea. This third one is an idea that I've seen in industry, and it exists today. So you know, you can generate custom cells to replace other cells in the block. For example, you identify that this supercell, like a bigger cell that basically is composed of a few others, like a complex cell, right? It can be generated and replace those cells in a spot. Okay, so that I've seen this before, so definitely something that has been in the industry as well. Okay, and I think finally the idea I'm kind of leaning towards today is that we could also do a post-processing sweep after the fact and make some local improvement. Okay, so I'm going to explore that idea a little more. Right, so for example, you can have this window, you slide the window around your layout, and wherever the window lands, then you can like undo that layout a little bit and make some modifications. Okay, so I feel like that idea can work, and I'm not aware of anybody doing that. So kind of trying to sell that idea today. Well, one thing very important to mention that definitely is a limitation that we need to be aware, right? And then probably the main problem of this crazy idea of going inside of a cell and changing it, right? The main problem is that all the cells are very, very, very well characterized. Okay, so I am saying very, very well. Well, first of all, they are simulated like crazy. Okay, so when you're characterizing a cell, you simulate all corners, like all temperature, everything. Like everything that variation and you simulate all kinds of delay scenarios like rise and fall, and input A, input B, swap that. There is a lot of electrical simulations that go on characterizing a cell, and then at the end you have a very large table that has a lot of numbers that basically describes all of the features of that cell. Okay, so it is an expensive characterization. But actually, there is an even more expensive one that we need to be aware as well. Generally, standard cells are also tested in the test chip, right? So when you add, when you are going to send a first test chip, or when you have a library, definitely you want to put that in the chip. You want to test it in silicon, and then you want to measure and verify your characterization numbers. Okay, so that's something that we need to be aware, okay, as the primary reason that stem cells are not touched today, right? And we have to think about that and how to solve that if we are to touch the cells. So, okay, so here's an agenda of this presentation, okay? I divided in two parts. They're distinct parts. The first part, I'm going to discuss more at algorithms level. What is out there that is relevant to this problem, and particularly, I think I'm talking about standard cell synthesis algorithms, because they are going to work for our idea that we're presenting on the second part. And I'm going to also discuss SAT-based algorithms, which I believe they are underused today, at least in my opinion. And I feel like those algorithms really can make a difference here. And the second part is where I'm going to dive a little deeper into the problems of the standard cell paradigm that we are basically paying today. What are we paying today to have this black box driven approach? But then and then I'll discuss, okay, what if we do this, right? And then we'll see what kind of benefit we can have. Okay, so the first part of the algorithms and problems that we have in the transistor level is placement, like as you know. But transistor placement is particularly different than cell placement, right? Because there is one property that you don't see anywhere else in the placement world, that is that you need to form a chain, right? So for example, if you look, I hope you guys can see my mouse pointer. I think you can. I'm here at this part of the screen. You have two transistors. I'm placing them next to each other. The reason is because they share a VDD net. Like if you ignore the gate for a moment, which is here, right, and you just look at the source and the drain of the transistor. Well, if you think of transistors as domino pieces, right, then you need to solve a little domino game here. And when you do that, then you can actually collapse the transistors right on top of each other, and that's the best way to save area. But whenever you cannot do that, then you have to leave a gap, right? So here's an example where we have a gap, right? We have this little chain here, and then a gap, and then another little chain there, right? And if we're good at dominoes game and we form nice chains, long chains, then we can save area, right? So we chain everything up, and then we can make the less breaks you have in your diffusion and your chains of the dominoes, the better. And it turns out that there is an Euler path algorithm and Euler path properties that I want to discuss a little bit today that help tremendously with this problem. Okay, and I'll leave that for the next slide. And I want to mention that placement is very hard. Okay, this one is not only hard because it's hard to find those chains. Actually, finding chains is not very hard. We have polynomial algorithms that can find chains. The problem is actually to find the best chain. Okay, and First of all, what is best is actually a very good question. It's not a problem where you can say, this is clearly a better solution than that. I mean, sometimes it's hard to say. So what is a good placement? A good placement would be a placement where you align the gates. I mean, you definitely want to align gates. So if you have a gate here, right? You have a gate here, you have a gate here. You want these gates to be aligned, meaning they are the same net, so that your routing is simple. So that's one thing you want to have in your placement. You also want to align these nets here. So like A and Y, if they were the same net, like, well, in this case, I don't have any example of alignment on the source and drain, but that's another alignment that is desirable. And the traditional metrics for wide length driven placement, also you want to minimize an estimated wide length metric, but to find the best placement is NP hard. And like, just to list algorithms that I've seen, I mean, these you see many papers that describe transistor placement, and they use these three algorithms. I feel like they're main ones that you find. So as I promised, I want to talk a little bit about this Euler path property. So again, I'm just focusing on dominoes, but I mean, if you look back, domino pieces, I mean, you have nets on both sides of the piece, right? So if you look at this piece here, this is a 5 and 3, right? If I make a graph of each one of the numbers like that, right? And then and these are the vertices of the graph, and then the edges of the graph, I'm going to make all of the pieces that I have available. Or if you think about transistor placement, that would be all of the transistors that I have to place. Okay, so each transistor would represent an edge. So by doing a very simple static analysis, which is how to count how many odd vertices you have, you can actually achieve a lot of things. So here, let me explain. This vertex is an even vertex because it has two edges coming out of it, or coming into it. But this one is an odd one because it has three edges, right? And this is also an odd one. Okay, so it turns out that there is a nice property if you have if you have a 0 or 2 odd vertices in your graph, no matter what the size of the graph is, you can actually form a chain that connects everything, which means that you don't have any gaps in your diffusion or any gaps in your chain, which is great. Okay, so this property can be found very fast, and you already know. And just doing that, you actually know what is the optimal placement area that you have. Okay, because counting how many odd vertices, you can estimate how many gaps you're going to have. So it's a nice property. All right, moving on to routing. Routing as well as placement is different than block level routing. Inside of in the transistor level, it's different. And why is that? Well, I think I want to highlight two main reasons that, in my opinion, are the most important ones. One of them is higher density. Okay, in the low level, you have things that are closer together that need to be connected. So, and you have it's harder to find. So it's the high density. It's harder to find a solution, and in many cases, there might be just a one feasible solution to solve it, and you have to find that one solution. And I like to compare routing at the transistor level with this flow game that you might be familiar. You can play it in your phone. It's actually this case is a small case, but in the game there are larger ones, and it's very hard to find. There is just one way to solve it, and you have to find it. Honestly, if you try to solve this with a traditional rip-up and reroute net by net algorithm, it's going to fail, or it will take a long time, because it really is a combination of factors that will ensure success. Okay, and it turns out that the way we solve the problem is actually net by net. So actually, playing this game, you can have a sense of how hard it is for a net by net algorithm to solve it. However, if you model this problem in SAT, okay, SAT actually in one shot finds that solution like trivially. It's like extremely simple for a SAT solver to solve this routing problem. Okay, so that is one reason why I want to say SAT-based routing is really good. So like I said, SAT can find a unique routing solution. If there is just one, it will find it. And also, I'll talk about that a little bit more in a subsequent slide. SAT can find the optimal solution. Imagine that you might have many possible solutions here. SAT can find you the best one, and if this problem is small enough, right? The second reason I feel like I want to spend some time talking is about complexity of design rules. Okay, so it turns out that in the lower levels, like in the poly and source and drain, there are different design rules, different nature, sometimes harder. Okay, so you need to model those rules, otherwise it's no use, right? So going further in that point, you need to deal with present and absent objects, and you need to handle multiple object rules. Like they are not simple spacing. Well, in the meta layers, they're also more complex than that. But I feel like it's important to think of when you have multiple object rules, each object can be coming from a different net, right? And it makes everything much harder, okay? So I want to make a bold statement here that I've done before in previous presentations I've made, and I think that this bold statement is that SAT solvers and SAT-based routers can model any arbitrary design. Okay, so that's actually a very bold statement, but I feel like that's true. And I want to prove that to you with an example of something that we've done at Intel a long time ago. But you might have seen this if you watch any presentation I give, because I really like it. It's a case where we want to talk about the smiley face pattern of vias. Okay, so imagine that these are vias, and this first hypothesis is, can we block a smiley face of vias, right? Why is that hard? Well, it's hard for the reason I just said, that there are multiple objects, and those objects could be coming from different nets. But it turns out that this modeling SAT is extremely simple, actually. It might be hard for the net-by-net routing, but for SAT, it's extremely simple because SAT solves all the nets at the same time, right? So I want to make it even harder. And the harder challenge is actually that I don't want, instead of blocking smiley face, let's do the exact opposite. Let's say that only smiley faces are allowed. Okay, so you can only have smiley faces in your chip, and you might think that it's a crazy rule. Obviously, it's a crazy rule, and it's not a real rule. But it turns out that SAT can solve this, even this crazy rule. And I would think it would be impossible, but we actually solved it, and I'll show it to you. Okay, so again, vias can only appear in this configuration, nothing else. Okay, so the way that okay, this is just an example. We apply to other blocks as well, but this example, we have 5 pins, 5 nets. They are all pins that are on the outside. You need to connect the ones together. You need to connect the twos together. So they are all 4 pin nets. So here's the routing, and I'm gonna hide the wires. So then you can see that all the vias, everything is connected, and all the vias are forming this smiley face. Okay, so I feel like this is really cool, and it kind of showcases how powerful these routers can be. To end this SAT talk, I have a couple more slides. One is I selected, I mean, honestly, if you read my paper on ISPD, this is a very short paper. And actually, the main thing about this paper I wanted to say is that I think there are some good references there. But, since that was published in 2022, you look at ISPD and DAC and ICCAT, there are more papers using SAT for standard cell synthesis. So you should also check those out. But I feel like this is an old one from Nikolai, and this is he describes the Intel cell synthesis tool, and here he used SAT, right? And he was reporting in the paper that you can build large flops using his SAT router. Okay. And it works by enumeration of routes. So you basically enumerate all possible, or like not all possible. He has a lot of pruning techniques. We just enumerate many possible routes, and the SAT solver selects the best route, as well as at the same time looking at DRCs, the way, for example, the smiley face or other DRCs, all taken care in one shot. Okay, I also select these 2 papers, and the reason I selected these 2 papers, and there might be many more actually, but these two papers, they demonstrate the generation of routing and placement together. Okay, so it's actually both problems modeled in SAT, and at this point in placement level, it doesn't matter routability, which is always so hard to predict in the placement level. That concept goes away because you're actually routing at the same time as you're placing. Okay, and so this is feasible, and this paper, they report large cells done with it. So actually, it's a feasible approach as well. And I want you to remember that you can do place and route together as we move on to the to my ideas that are presenting in the second part of the talk. This one is just one tiny example of the large world of MaxSAT. Okay, so this is a very well-established field on the SAT solving community. Okay, and I just selected this paper because I like Alex. He's a great guy and he has good papers and he's very smart. But there are many papers that I could have mentioned here. This one is one that I read and I feel like it's a good paper. And it describes how you can use anytime techniques. But the main point is MaxSAT is basically an extension of SAT where you can find optimal solutions. So remember when I mentioned that you can find optimal routing? Well, it turns out that you need MaxSAT, but if you have that, you can really solve problems optimally, which is amazing for small problems, of course. Okay, and then this is one more slide I wanted to mention that I feel like it's a technique that I use it in practice sometime for certain problems, and it works well. So the technique goes like this. You have your SAT model, which is represented by this cloud here, and you run check SAT, meaning you find a solution for that. And let's say that if that solver says no, meaning, okay, this is your model is bad. Okay, so I'm going to ignore this case, assuming that the model is good and correct, and you can find a solution, right? Then you can run an external checker. Let's say that there is some violation. And violation here, I mean, it could be a design rule violation, or it could be a timing violation, or it could be anything really. Okay, so it's some kind of checker. You have an external checker, and you check that model. And so this is external, so it's not a SAT-based checker, like just an ordinary checker. And let's say the checker says no. Okay, so you can take this feedback and you can add clauses to prevent these problems that the checker is pointing out. And then you can feed that to the model and iterate. Okay, so SAT solvers are incremental. Well, some of them or most of them, and I wouldn't imagine working with non-incremental one. So it needs to be incremental. And it turns out that the first time you run check SAT is low, but the second time will be much faster. And the reason is the solver maintains a state, right, and reasoning. So as part of the reasoning of the SAT solver is to eliminate clauses that are already solved, and it eliminates things. So the state always is smarter than the previous state. It just keeps getting smarter, So as you keep going and potentially iterating a few times here, tendency is that your runtime is not going to be too bad as in the subsequent iterations, right? So this actually is a model that I used in practice to solve hard problems where modeling them with SAT would be really hard, but doable. For example, timing. How do you model timing with SAT? I mean, it's really hard, right? So that kind of problem, I would recommend an approach like this. Okay, I think I'm done with the first part, and let's go to the second part now. And the second part, I will start with that same slide that we had in the first beginning of the talk, right? Yeah, we are back to the point where we are saying the cells don't connect perfectly, and now I want to explain that. And I have basically 4 topics that I'm gonna dive a little deeper into them. One of them is design rules, and when I say design rules, I mean the definition of design rules. So, for example, the guys that are working in lithography or guys working the definition of design rules, they need to be aware of the methodology that we are doing, like standard cell methodology, right? And they need to create rules that are feasible to us, okay? Well, that introduces problems to them, big problems actually, and we'll talk about that. The second thing I want to say is actually a very simple thing, and it's a very obvious thing actually, that many times you have things that are misaligned, and they could be aligned and with your neighbors, and if they were aligned, the routing would be much better. Third thing is that I will tell you a little bit about diffusion breaks and how actually turns out that we have a lot of white space in your layout, a lot more white space than you might think in your layout. And the fourth thing is about neighborhood. Neighborhood that you have should affect your decisions inside of the cell, and I'll get to that. And the big red box, we're talking about characterization, right? So everything is pre-characterized. Well, that's the problem that we will face, and I'll talk about recharacterization a little bit later in the talk. So let's start with the design rule thing. Okay, so like I said, in the lithography world, you find that there is a pattern of a layout that is not printable, and I'm not gonna get deeper into why it's not printable. That I actually don't understand, but it might be a pattern that is large, like 6 vias, for example. In this example, I'm just making it up, okay? It's not like a real pattern here. I wouldn't be allowed to talk about real patterns, right? But I can tell you that these patterns can be quite large, okay? And especially today at the nodes that we are at, right? So advanced, right? So you have large patterns. Well, it turns out that these patterns can be longer than your small inverter or your NAND. So how would you be able to solve that in the standard cell? How would you be able to do a standard cell that will basically violate this pattern? If you, depending on who is your neighbor, it will violate this pattern. Okay, if it's too large, actually you can't do it. Okay, so the solution to having a very large pattern is actually making your process more expensive by eliminating that problem. Okay, so that's a trick that they always do. So if, for example, introduction of new masks, or other process tricks that they might do to actually eliminate such things. So there is a price of not of trying to avoid layout patterns that they don't like standard cell methodology. There is a price for that. Now, assuming that we already simplified the pattern, and now we're going to work with a simpler rule that is a square. Okay, so 4 vias. And again, a made-up rule, but let's say that we want to now avoid this one rule instead, okay? So now the rule can fit, let's say, is your small inverter, but still you have the problem with the borders, okay? And the borders are a problem, right? So how can you make sure that this cell here that has 2 patterns, 2 vias on the outside, that your neighbor won't have 2 vias as well and violate your pattern? Oh, well, the only way to make sure is to model what we call a border rule, or another way to make sure would be to change your legalizer to prevent that. But once you change your legalizer, you're going to pay density, right? You're going to pay price of density. Well, by adding a border rule, let's say we add a border rule, you're also going to pay some price. And especially because your border rule will be pessimistic by nature, because you don't know what's on the other side, right? So you are going to have to prevent a 2 via pattern. And that's actually, like here, you're going to have to prevent this pattern, even though your neighbor might be okay with you, but you still have to prevent it. Okay, so it is another point of pain here, that you have to always worry about the borders, okay? So that is one problem with standard cell methodology that we have today, right? If all the layout was transistor level, no borders, then all of these problems would completely go away, right? I'm not saying that we can avoid the borders altogether. I'm not saying anything. I'm just here posing the problem, right? Definitely, if you can make the borders a little softer than today, maybe you don't have to go as deep into this stuff as we have to go today, right? definitely I can say that much. Okay, so that was one problem. Now let's talk about the other things, and these other things I'm kind of gonna zoom in like a small portion of your layout, right? And this is it's a quite an obvious problem that I'm pretty sure everybody knows and agrees that, for example, let's say you have an inverter, and here I'm coming with a very simple case. You have an inverter, and you're connected to an inverter right next to you, right? So that can happen, or it can be an AND. It doesn't matter. So if the cell if you have a same cell right next to you, it's the same instance of it's another instance of the same cell. Then the track that has the input and track that has the output are going to be the same. But you always want to connect the output to the input, right? So what happens is, in order to connect this guy to this guy, you need to form this ugly Z shape. Here you're adding vias. You are adding a lot of complexity. You're going up you're going up 2 layers up. But it turns out that if you look at this cell inside, flipping these tracks, it would be extremely simple, actually. I mean, inside of the cell, that can totally be done. It wouldn't cause anything, wouldn't cause any harm to the cell. Probably characterization would be just fine. I can't imagine any problem with that. You just do that, and you can just make this simple connection. You align things to your neighbor, and then you can make a simple connection here. I feel like this is quite an obvious scenario. I'm not even, you see, in this talk, I'm not even discussing very complex scenarios where you need a lot of layout changes. This is a very simple one. Okay, another category of inefficiencies are the transistor gaps. Okay, so it turns out that, I don't know if you ever thought about that. Actually, I don't think people think about this, is that at every cell border, there is always a gap. Okay, so if you look at this place, all of these purple boxes are gaps in your transistor, meaning white space in the low layers, right? There is no transistor there, so you are basically, I mean, you might think that this is a very high density, right? And it is high density, but well, in addition to that, these little white spaces here, there is also a gap right there at every border, right? And the reason is, well, we don't know what's your neighbor going to be, so you have to leave a gap, right? But if you, for example, if every cell has power, every cell has power as part of their nets, and they going now back to the dominoes game we had in the beginning. If you look at this cell here, this cell has power on the outside. Okay, if this cell had power on the outside, actually connect right there, they can actually prevent this gap altogether. Okay, so that's something you can do. Well, in this case, you can't quite do that because you don't have power on the outside. But again, it turns out that flipping these transistors here and moving power to the outside and O to the inside is still a legal placement. And it might be slightly worse or even slightly better, depending on the metric, than before. But then the benefits you get on the block level are very large, because you can now make these things shorter, and you can make wires crossing this direction shorter as well. And there is potentially a lot of things you can improve by doing a simple transformation inside of the cell, right? So here I've done it in a little animation, right? And you can say that now this is a bigger cell, or just two cells that are overlapping, and you might have to adjust the routing a little bit. That's why I wanted you to remember those papers that were doing place and route at the same time. Here's where you could use that algorithm very clearly, right? Like, you're not doing full placement, meaning only you want to do placement only of some things you that are not like you can give a distance. For example, you can give a maximum distance you want to deviate from your original location, or you might say that flipping is okay as well, or you might have a limitation of how many moves you want to make. Or, I mean, you can specify some bounds to your placement problem, That way it scales much better, it runs much faster. And then you can do routing together. You can start from something that is already routed, and if you model this in one shot, you can do such transformations and get better layout potentially. Now, can you guarantee better layout? Actually, it turns out that you can guarantee better layout, because in your SAT solver you can give bounds. You can give bounds. For example, you can limit only moves that will improve your wire length, or you can measure. In the worst case, you can measure your result, and if you don't like it in the end, and you can always revert back to its initial state, and the initial state is a safe state. We can always do that, right? So anyway, let me move on. Here's another idea. You can bring transistors from another cell. You might think this is extreme. Well, it is a little extreme, actually. We moved transistor from another cell here, but now layout is even better potentially. This is a picture of what we've done. Like I've grabbed some, this blue box. I kind of detached two devices out of the blue box and move it way left, right? And then here, this red box, we split in half. Is this legal? Well, it is legal, right? I mean, if we can guarantee that layout is better, there is no downside here other than the characterization, which we'll talk later. Here's another one. This is a more extreme idea, I think. You have this entire block of cells. You throw that all in a blender, and you generate like a big supercell that has all of that stuff in it. But the big supercell will be done on the fly, and it will be a one instance cell. I mean, it's just a cell for this location, and it is optimized for this neighborhood. So obviously, if you have a connection going left, you want to move those devices left because you know your neighborhood, right? And you can do that. And I kind of mentioned already that you can work under timing constraints. You can either incorporate your timer at the end, the way that I showed you before, like in a loop, or you can have your timer in the beginning, and you can attempt some scenarios, and you can pre-time that, and you can only have the ones that are acceptable as a solution for you to be explored by the SAT solver. So there are ways to do that. And you can characterize this. Okay, so this supercell, I no doubt you can characterize, right, after it's done. So I think reiterating what I'm proposing here, right, you can have a sliding window or many sliding windows kind of going around your circuit, right? And definitely you can prioritize critical locations where, we do so much to improve our critical paths, right? Like there is so much we do. I'm not sure why we don't consider to actually change a little bit the cells. Like I said, sometimes it can be very little changes in the cell can make a big difference. SAT and SMT solvers, they can find optimal solutions to these problems. Find the best possible route, like a very localized route. It can be done in a very reasonable time. But we definitely need to talk about characterization, right? And I saved this to the end. But honestly, I don't have a fully cooked solution here, but I do have some thoughts. Okay, the first thought, this block right here, that I want to discuss is that we already live in a world where things are not fully characterized. Okay, so while the cells are extremely well characterized, like I said before, they are not characterized to what they are attacking, or the neighborhood that they have is not very well characterized. So cell neighborhood is poorly considered. What is connected to the cell is also poorly considered. We try like a few things that we can, right? But more importantly, the wiring is not considered. It's not part of the characterization, right? The resistance of wires. I mean, is not fully characterized at the same way, at the same level as the cells, right? So there is a lot of things that are not characterized, and we deal with that, right? So that's the first point I wanted to make. The second point I want to make is that recharacterizing these cells is actually completely doable thing, right? So, for example, if you think about that scenario I was showing you before, where you have all of these cells kind of in a cluster, right? So we modified layout for all of these cells, let's say, right? So we can recharacterize those cells. Like, for example, the red cell that was split apart can still be considered a one cell thing, even though it's split apart. You can still recharacterize only this portion because this portion is a functional unit, right? So you can characterize that, recharacterize that. And then, you would recharacterize the same way as you did before. Obviously, you cannot send this to the test chip. So the test chip part, I'm kind of leaving on the side. But you can recharacterize this, and you might like the new characterization. In that case, you keep it, or you might say, no, this is actually turns out to be a lot worse, and you revert back to the original state, right? You always can come back to the safe state that was the initial state. You can always do that. What else? Well, there is a big advantage here that maybe people don't realize, is that when you recharacterize a cell, you know exactly the neighborhood. You know exactly how much load it is receiving from inputs, attacking, fan out, fan in, everything you know exactly. And you can characterize, actually your recharacterization will be more accurate than your original characterization. Okay, so there is that I wanted to mention. Finally, timing of supercell can be measured in the context of a transistor level analysis. Yeah, I think it's the same point. Okay, like you can recharacterize that larger block as well. Okay, so I think I'm approaching the end here. So I think that another main message of this presentation was degree of freedom not explored today. Okay, we basically don't explore all of these ideas because we are very much stuck with the black box methodology, and for good reasons. I'm not saying that they're not good reasons, for very good reasons actually. But it is a degree of freedom of improving the quality of your routing, your placement, that we don't explore, and it's there. It's available. We can do it. I mean, it's legal. Okay, answering the question, it is legal in terms of design rule violations. We are not breaking any rules, but it's hard to do. Okay, I'm not saying it's easy to do. There is a lot of things that require research, but it is a path to get all of these goodies here. Especially wires and vias, I think it's very clear. The others you might argue, but especially the border rules, I feel like, yes, we can. For example, if there is a pattern in lithography that it's very hard to happen, but it happens sometimes, we can leave it and maybe deal it as in post-processing. I mean, it's a feasible thing, right? So I feel like these are good reasons to consider this approach. And yeah, I think that's it. That concludes my talk. I think we have some time for questions now. Thank you, guys. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Renato. Very nice talk as always. So time for questions. So please do your questions as soon as possible using the chat channel. So we have one here by.
Can I see these questions, Reis? I'm not seeing anything.
Yes.
Oh, I see. Click on comment.
Oh, yeah. So first question by Supriyo Bhattacharya. Are there any open tools scripts that allow us to explore these designs?
Open tools and scripts allow. Well, I'm not sure I understand the question. Like, these designs would be. I don't know if I understand the question, but I think the answer, as far as I know, is no. Okay, I don't know. I'm not aware of open tools and scripts that can do this. Honestly, I feel like these things are quite. These ideas in general, I don't see them anywhere. So I think the answer is no to that first question. But maybe I misunderstood the question. If you want to try retyping it, I can. Maybe let's give him a chance to.
Okay, so now a question by Professor Marcelo Johan. So how large the SAT model can be, number of closes or number of transistors in a cell, also consider the complexity of the rules. There is a second part. I mean, when we try to obey more constraint, the problem gets harder and the SAT can start to become prohibitively slow. So how far can we expect to go in size and scarcity of solutions?
Okay, I can answer that question. So number of clauses is in the order of billions. Okay, order of billions. A SAT solver can handle billions of clauses with no problem, actually. Let's see, number of transistors in a cell. Okay, so that will depend on what are you modeling as what you want to do. For example, going back to that idea, I feel like, let me go back a few slides here. So I was talking about this idea, right? Or that, or let's start with this one. So this one was like, I'm considering flipping and like small movements. So for example, if I want to do placement changes and routing changes at the same time, right? I'm not allowing free placement, meaning I don't want to completely disrupt the original solution, right? So you can model this problem as like a very incremental placement change where you allow place devices to move only one cell to the one gap to the left or one gap to the right, and they can flip. So you can allow by limiting your window, then it's gonna be you're gonna be able to run this very fast. Actually, I feel like if I answer your question a different way, like if you look at like standard cell synthesis tools and how much they can do, being SAT based, they can do large flops. Large flops can have up to 100 devices. But those in those cases, you are basically completely free, right? You are doing the cell from scratch. Now, if you're not doing a cell from scratch, right, you are trying to reuse the initial state and incremental on that, then you can actually go much bigger than that. So we're probably talking about a few hundred cell devices would be okay. I think I answered. Let's see the second part.
Second part is here.
Second part. You can always use timeouts with SAT as well, and they work well. And you would give up if it becomes too slow. I think that's a trick that you can always also do to prevent that. Okay, let's move to the next one.
Okay, you go back to Suprio. So Suprio is
Yes.
from University of Virginia, USA.
Yes. Okay. Scripts for generating these logic
So I
structures
need
using
scripts for
transistors.
generating these logic structures using transistor that are power, area, delay optimal. Are there any open resources available? I mean, I assume a machine learning based approach might be used.
Okay, so I think what you are looking for is basically standard cells where that are open, and I don't know. I would assume so, but I don't know how to help you more than just assuming that you can find these. And about your second part, machine learning based approach might be used. I've seen that. I think I've seen that question asked a million times, and the answer of half the people is yes, and half the people is no. And I think I'm going to stay in the middle here. Machine learning can definitely do placement and routing. However, I do believe personally, that's my view. I believe that SAT is way better than machine learning for this particular problem. Okay, I think that we can go to the next, Hayes.
Okay, so I have a question now by Ney Calazan, Professor Ney Calazans. Can you comment on the processing overheads to perform the local optimizations you mentioned? I believe this implies to complex module design. Can this be made at module synthesis time?
Okay, I need to think about this one. Local optimizations. I'm not sure I understand that part. Okay. Passing your head. I think question is about runtime, if I'm understanding. And so first of all, I want to say that SAT-based algorithms are definitely slower than others. So there is overhead. I'm not sure. So local optimizations, you were asking about MaxSAT potentially, right? And if you want to clarify that, and this can be actually, Nay, I'm sorry, I don't know if I understand your question. I don't know if people can speak. Can people speak, or it's just text-based?
Text-based now.
Text-based, okay. Let me read one more time. I think let's go to the next question. I don't understand the question, Hayes. Let's move on, please.
Okay.
If Ney wants to clarify, I can come back to it.
Yeah. So now a question by Enrique Kessler. So Enrique didn't include his institution and location. So splitting the cell devices interleaving with other cells sounds like a routing nightmare. Is the area again worth the probably extra delay and the uncertainty in the new design worth it?
It's a very good question. Okay, this one I can answer. So it could be a nightmare for the router, but it may not be a nightmare for the router. Okay, I feel like in some cases it could be, and if it is a nightmare for the router, then definitely it's not worth it. Okay, so yeah, you eliminate a gap, but then you have to the routing becomes so much worse, right? And like I said, if you measure the characterization at the end, and if the performance is worse than before, you give it up. Also, you can constrain your router such that it will not do anything worse than your original solution. So for example, let's say that your original solution, you have, for example, here you have nets. Let me go back to the slide. Here you have net A, J, K. You have all of these nets, right? So you have, previously you measure the wire length of these nets, and the wire length is this much. Now, after these crazy moves of placement, you can constrain that the router can only stay within that wire length, or maybe you accept 10% more, or you can. So I think one point I want to make very clear is that you can model all of these constraints in the SAT solver. SAT solver is very flexible, and I try to make that point in the beginning, right? SAT solver can accept any modeling whatsoever. You can model wire length as a constraint to your router, and then you can, when you run your placement and routing together, you can run such that the routing must stay within certain bounds of quality. Okay, so I want to make that clear. Your question is good because obviously it's not worth having a router nightmare. But my whole point I was trying to make is that if you model the problem correctly, your routing, you're only going to take it if the routing is improved, or at least the same.
Okay, so just to know that Enrique is from Federal University of Pelotas, Brazil. So we have here extra words from Ney saying that the
Yes.
local optimizations are those you propose across cell borders.
Right. Okay. Across cell borders. Right. So I think that border rules. Right. Can we go back to the original? Let me make my
Yes.
screen bigger here. Processing overheads of. Oh yeah. Okay. So border rules. Now I think if that I understand that correctly, border rules are very expensive. Actually, they're. So first of all, they are a nightmare for designers. Like even coming up with such border rules are is something very hard to do. Often that coming up with border rules, often can become like a challenge so big that you have to change the original design rule, such that the border rule is feasible. So that whole idea of redefining rules to fit the standard cell methodology is a big problem. All right. I think we have a new question here. Let me see.
Yeah, John.
Okay,
John,
how much improvement in terms of delays and performance you think is still possible? I'm talking about 5%, maybe. But 5% is a lot. It might sound like a little bit, but after everything is optimized and everything is great, you get another 5%, or even 1%. It can be really good. So I'm definitely, we're not talking about orders of magnitude improvements. We're talking about few percent.
okay. So I'm seeing no more questions here in the chat. If you still have one, you should do this now. But I have one question for Renato. So in slide 29, please. Yeah, you are swapping the cells, but this means also that you change the position of diffusion P to diffusion N.
No, not necessarily, Hayes. Not necessarily.
No?
Actually, so sometimes, for example, sometimes you can have an entire column of source and drain. Your source and drain layer depends on which technology you're talking about. It can be called different things, or even poly. Let's talk about poly. If your poly is aligned on top and bottom, right, you have a large poly that spans across the whole cell. And you might have a large source and drain structure that also spans across the whole cell. And you just chose to drop the via for the input on the top and the via for the output on the bottom. You can actually do that swap without changing N and P. You just leave that completely untouched. You just drop a via on another place. It's actually extremely simple, and you can have a very clean connection. Did that make sense?
Yes. So the question by Young Lapas. So he's saying that he's from Kaiserslautern, Germany.
Oh yes, I think I answered this one already. He's
Yeah,
asking how much percent and
yeah. So I see no more questions now. So thank you very much, Renato, for the
my
excellent
pleasure.
talk as always. And so thank you again. I hope to see you in person in a near future.
Well, I
And
felt compelled to go to those conferences. So that would be nice.
yeah, it
Maybe.
will be great. Yeah.